So while we've all been speaking about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on all parts of our lives, there's a battle that's been going on in the courts, and that is between the government and public sector unions. 2 years ago, some background now, long negotiations between the government and employees resulted in this latest multi-year wage agreement that then set guidelines for pay increases across different employment grades. Lower level staff, for example, were to receive a 7% pay increase for the first year, and then CPI +1 per person. That's while higher earning civil servants were promised 6% then CPI-based increases for the remainder of the agreement. Political economist Kaya Stoller joins us now to talk more about this. And Kaya, you've written on this subject at the start of this week. Were those increases that were promised in that multi-year agreement ever going to materialize, based on the fact that 2 years ago South Africa was already in such dire straits economically?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to the viewers. Look, I think the problem, of course, is when the agreement was signed in 2018, it's not like we're in a high-growth economy where suddenly everybody would say we can definitely afford these increases. So there was always a question around the affordability, even long before we got to where we are now. And I think what has happened historically is that for the government, whenever it has had to fund or finance these huge increases for civil service, it simply redirected funds from elsewhere, or in some cases even had to go and borrow in order to finance it. Now the appetite for borrowing and indeed the capacity to borrow the money to finance these increases just quite simply doesn't exist. So now we need to try and figure out how this whole exercise is going to be financed.
So on financing this agreement, where would the money come from? Because government is facing this issue that Labour says, let's go to court and fight it out. You've got the finance minister who's said now for the better part of the last year that what actually needs to happen is we need to trim the public sector wage bill.
Well, the one way is obviously if you cut down the cost, then you wouldn't have to raise the money. So in the budget that we saw, the finance minister Tito Mboweni tabling, he said that he's going to actually reduce the expenses by around 160 billion rand over the medium term. So if you can be able to achieve then there isn't much of a problem. Now, how one achieves that is a bit difficult, because one of the options that the government always exercises is to encourage people to really volunteer to leave the civil service. In an economy that's struggling like ours, it's going to be difficult for that, because when you leave the civil service, where are you going to go when no one else is hiring? So that's very unlikely to happen. And I think the secondary problem is that if you're in a country that could be able to raise additional revenue from taxes, then the problem wouldn't be as great as it is right now. But we now know, even this morning, the finance minister reiterated that tax collections are going to plummet on the basis that the economy is currently at a gridlock. So we know that the money is not going to come from the revenue side. We know that the appetite of civil servants to voluntarily leave the civil service is going to be diminished, which means that the government has to go and find another way of raising the money if they obviously cannot convince the unions to say, let us revisit this agreement.
One of the things you've spoken about in writing about the subject is that this agreement was reached in the run-up to the last national election, and that, to a degree, you say, ties in with the idea of public sector workers as a voting constituency. How real is that view? And if government had not agreed, has it been tested that if public sector workers, for example, aren't given what they want, there would be a loss for the ANC government at the ballot?
So what unfortunately has happened over the past 25 years is that the ANC has never taken that gamble. So whenever there is a dispute over wages ahead of a general election, the government always, without fail, yields to what the demands of the unions are. So I think the big problem here is that we've seen in instances where they haven't yielded, we've seen public service strikes where obviously it becomes very crippling to the economy at large, because civil servants are quite important for a lot of the parts of the economy require the civil service to be highly active. So because now we know that when the civil servants do go on strike, there are definitely going to be consequences. Politicians are definitely not going to be taking those gambles and really trying to renegotiate wage agreements ahead of a general election, not only because the civil service itself comes to a standstill, but because there's always the question, or rather the anxiety of, well, what happens if the civil servants then do not pitch up to vote? Because we still think that a lot of the people that work in the civil service will somehow find a way to make their way way to the ballot. And if they do make their way to the ballot, we're hoping that they vote for us. So politicians are not going to take the alternative gamble of saying, well, it doesn't matter if they don't show up at all, because then the risk is that the people that don't show up are the people that might have actually voted for you, that might have retained you in power. So it's a gamble that the government just simply never takes. So we don't actually know what happens.
Would you agree then that Labour has the upper hand still in the relationship, especially where the tripartite alliance is concerned?
I think, yeah, Labour does definitely have the upper hand in this case, because I think the big problem that Labour has highlighted is how they were ambushed into this forced renegotiation. So what happened here is that the minister makes a deliberation in Parliament. He says that we're going to cut the civil service a wage bill by 160 billion rand. And then the second thing that happened is that on the date that this latest round of wage increases was supposed to kick in, being the 1st of April, the state quite simply didn't effect that. So, of course, this wasn't as a result of them having gone back to Labour and said, please let us renegotiate, and then them saying, actually, on the 1st of April, we're not going to implement. It was simply a matter of Labour says that they heard it through the grapevine, that the wage agreement was not going to be honoured, and then they saw the actual implementation of the wage agreement not being honoured on the 1st of April, which is why they're now saying, well, we need to sue in order for the state to honour its agreement. So I think the finance minister, unfortunately engaged in bad faith. Well, at least that's what Labour would like us to believe. So had he done this on a good faith basis, at least they would have been able to reach some consensus and saying either we defer the implementation of the wage agreement until after the pandemic, for example, or we find an alternative way. So it's been a failure on both parties not to be able to engage in good faith in order to be able to avoid this particular impasse.
Kaya Stole, thank you so much for that.